Okay, let's discuss plyometrics. Now, plyometrics are usually body weight movements designed to try to reduce the amount of time it takes an individual to respond to a force. And so in a plyometric, you usually have some kind of landing on the ground followed by some kind of leaving the ground. And the time it takes them from landing to leaving the ground while still exemplifying the same amount of power when leaving the ground represents how good they are at performing plyometrics and how elastic that athlete is. If you have an athlete who lands and then produces a 30-inch vertical, but he had to stay on the ground for 2 seconds to deal with those ground reaction forces, he's not athletic. He's not as athletic as an athlete that lands and in half a second leaves the ground and still performs a 30-inch vertical. And so the ability to absorb and then redirect that force with dealing with the ground is what we're trying to work on when doing plyometric work. Now, plyometrics can be divided up into kind of 3 categories. Plyometrics focused on producing force, plyometrics focused on absorbing force, and plyometrics focused on redirecting force. And so redirecting force is really the accumulation of absorbing and producing force, but sometimes you might have an athlete that's really good at absorbing but not very good at producing. So you might pick plyometric drills focused more on producing force and vice versa. Or you have a pretty well-rounded athlete and therefore the majority of their plyometric diet should be on just redirection drills. So prescription-wise for plyometrics though, this is another double-edged sword. Just like including sprinting in strength and conditioning routine for athletes, I find the 2 places that athletes start to overtrain or have overuse injuries occur is in their speed agility work or in their plyometric work. It's not usually in their weightlifting unless they're just following their own program and deciding to max every week to see if they got stronger. Usually in the actual strength training aspect of their training regimen, there's very few injuries that occur as long as they're following some kind of stepwise progression. But when it comes to plyometrics, it's really easy to start getting plantar fascia issues, Achilles tendon issues, or anterior knee pain or shin splints with your athletes if they're not mindful of how much plyometric stuff they're doing. And so as a general rule, when we're counting plyometrics, we want to count foot contacts. And so if you do a drill that is 5 hurdle hops, that's 5 foot contacts. Whereas if you do 3 box jumps, that would be 3 foot contacts. Now in a day, we usually want to stick to about 25 high intensity foot contacts. So if you're doing like pogos to warm up in the dynamic warm-up with your athletes and the pogos are relatively light, you don't need to count that. But I'm talking high intense, like jump over a hurdle, land, get right back up off the ground, jump as high as you can, land, jump high, land, jump high, etc. 25 of those foot contacts a day is kind of ideal. And so when most people hear that number, they then think to themselves, oh my gosh, I've been programming 100 foot contacts a day with my athletes. Or they just prescribe a lot of low-end plyometrics, and so they get away with 100 foot contacts. But those low-end, low-energy plyometrics don't tend to actually develop that elastic trait of high force absorption and redirection that really you want out of your power athletes. And so sticking to that 25 foot contacts a day, and then in a week's time, trying to stay at about 100 foot contacts. So that means if you weight train 4 days a week, you can fit 25 foot contacts in each day. If you weight train 5 days a week, maybe only do plyos on your first 2 days, take the middle day off from plyos, get a little more strength training in, and then your last 2 days get 25 plyos. Now you want to also consider your speed work as well. If you're doing a lot of speed work, let's say on Monday and Thursday, then maybe those are also your plyo, your heavier plyo days. And then maybe Tuesday and Friday, since you're not doing speed work, also pull back the plyos so that the tissue involved with sprinting and with plyometrics has an opportunity to cool off and freshen up for the next session. I'm going to leave you with one more thing. A lot of people do box jumps for plyometrics. This would primarily be a force production drill, but I find that this is a pretty bad drill because it's only force production and it's usually from a standstill. And what a lot of high school athletes do is they focus on how high the box is, when that doesn't matter. But because we can measure it in inches, it becomes a contest between each other to see who can jump on the highest box. But usually what ends up happening is they end up jumping onto a box that they actually can't jump onto. They can just lift their legs up quick and land on it. And so if you have an athlete jumping on a box and they do this, their hip in space moved 0 inches. They didn't actually produce force and leave the ground. They just lifted their legs up really quick and caught themselves on a box. So if you are doing box jumps with your athletes, what you want to cue them to do is to jump as high as they can. Have them jump up onto the box, and then that way when they land, their hip in space actually moved, and so they exemplified power. Now, if you want to make this a little more of an actual plyometric, because the box jump in and of itself is not really a plyometric, you can add a bounce beforehand, and that's what I prefer to do. I prefer to have them do a bounce, and then right at the end of that bounce, jump up onto the box. So bounce, and then jump up. And that way, we added an impulse on the ground that they had to overcome to then redirect force up onto the box.